What would you do if you walked into the very bank you run, only to be treated like you didn't belong there? A polite woman dressed modestly stood quietly in line waiting to withdraw money at the teller counter. The staff glanced at her, whispering. A manager approached, eyes full of suspicion, and a tone that implied, "That much money, is it really yours?" What they didn't know was that this woman was actually the chief executive officer of the entire banking system. This is not a fictional story. This was the moment when an anonymous black CEO became a living witness to the very biases she had committed her career to dismantling. And that moment, within just a few hours, changed the fate of a single branch and the culture of one of the nation's top financial institutions. If you've ever been judged by your appearance, if you believe respect should never be based on skin color or clothing, then this is a story you cannot miss. This is the journey of Monique Ellis, a woman who walked into a bank as just another customer and walked out as a game changer. The wall clock in the grand lobby of Sterling Capital Bank's Ashford branch struck 9:17 a.m. Everything seemed normal inside the luxurious marble-tiled space, the steady hum of a money counter, the occasional clacking of keyboards and fragmented conversations between staff and customers. But something was different that morning, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that no one noticed, at least not yet. A middle-aged black woman sat quietly in the waiting area. Her outfit was modest, a brown cardigan, ash-gray slacks, and an old but carefully maintained handbag. Her natural hair was neatly pinned up, her face elegant, her eyes calm, seemingly unmoved by the indifference unfolding around her. None of the staff at the Ashford branch recognized who she was. They didn't bother to notice. To them, she was just another customer, or worse, someone not worth their time. A young teller named Tina glanced over and then leaned down to whisper to a colleague, "Looks like a homeless woman trying to withdraw money." Both chuckled. Richard, a senior employee nearby, overheard and smirked, nodding in agreement as if it were an obvious truth. None of them knew that the woman waiting was Monique Ellis, the current chief executive officer of Sterling Capital Bank. She said nothing, didn't show any sign of discomfort, nor did she raise her voice. Monique simply sat there, her eyes carefully observing every transaction taking place. A white man in a suit walked in and, before he even reached the counter, was warmly greeted and ushered into a private room by a staff member. Moments later, an elderly Asian woman was given brief hand gestures with no verbal greeting or smile. A white woman in athletic wear was called after just 2 minutes of waiting. Meanwhile, Monique had been sitting there for nearly 25 minutes, despite the lobby not being crowded. Finally, she stood and approached the counter. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," she said softly, presenting her identification along with a withdrawal slip that clearly stated $115,000. Beth, the young teller behind the counter, frowned. Her eyes scanned the ID, then looked up at Monique as if trying to determine whether this was some sort of mistake. "That's a large amount," she said, her tone openly skeptical, loud enough for those nearby to take notice. "Yes," Monique replied calmly. "I'm aware of my withdrawal limits, and this request is well within them." Beth didn't respond. She turned and whispered to Mark, a senior employee, and the two of them glanced over at the woman. The indifference slowly shifted into suspicion, and then gradually became something more hostile, an unspoken confrontation. What no one realized was that in less than an hour, they would witness something none of them could have anticipated, a complete reversal of power, of position, and of truth. And the woman they had dismissed that morning, the one who walked in with an unassuming appearance, would soon force the entire bank to take a hard look at itself. Before she became the quiet woman seated amidst indifference and misjudgment at the Ashford branch, Monique Ellis was a name no one knew. But it was from that obscurity that she rose step by step with intellect, unwavering determination, and a dignity that never compromised. Over 20 years ago, Monique was a trainee teller, wearing a light blue uniform with a plastic name tag on her chest. Monique E. Teller Trainee. At the time, she hadn't yet graduated from college, working night shifts at Sterling Capital Bank to cover tuition and help support her aging mother and 2 younger siblings. Sterling Capital, back then, wasn't a dream, it was survival. Yet from that seemingly ordinary place, she began laying the foundation for an extraordinary career. Unlike those who sought shortcuts, Monique chose depth. She didn't just process transactions, she read every line of the operations manual, including the footnotes. She asked more questions, observed more closely, and stayed later than her shifts. Her evenings behind the teller counter became real-world classrooms for a student determined to rise beyond the limits society had placed on people like her. Just 3 years later, Monique was promoted to head teller. At the time, many whispered that it was because of the diversity initiative. They didn't know that Monique had discovered and corrected a systemic error in the credit processing system that saved the branch nearly $200,000 in 1 quarter. But she didn't need praise, only results and real change. From head teller, she became branch manager, then regional director. When she was selected for a full MBA scholarship to Harvard, people in the company began to take notice. Not because of her gender or the color of her skin, but because she consistently achieved what others called impossible. A branch in Ohio labeled unsalvageable posted record growth just 18 months after she took over. Step by step, Monique became a quiet symbol of resilience. Never boastful, never arrogant, but always steadfast. When she was appointed as the National Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Capital, she began to see things most refused to face. Stark disparities in how the bank served different groups of customers. The overall reports looked great, but when broken down by region, race, and neighborhood, the patterns were undeniable and troubling. Despite wearing designer suits and walking into board meetings with top executives, Monique never forgot the eyes of those customers once denied for being unqualified, even when their applications met every requirement. She didn't lead solely with strategy, but also with empathy, a trait too often undervalued in finance. When the CEO of Sterling Capital retired unexpectedly, the board faced a difficult decision. Monique's resume was flawless: 20 years of service, exceeding targets in every role, a Harvard education. And still, some board members hesitated, not because of her capabilities, but because of her image. "Will major clients feel comfortable with a black woman as the face of the bank?" one member whispered during a closed meeting. But when the votes were cast, Monique Ellis, 47 years old, once a trainee, was officially named the first black woman CEO in Sterling Capital's history. She didn't cry. She simply smiled. In her inaugural address, she said, "Success is not measured by skin color, gender, or background. It is measured by actions. And I promise you this, no one will walk into this bank and feel like they are lesser." No one in the Ashford branch waiting room that morning knew any of this. No one knew that the woman they were silently judging with half smirks and skeptical glances was the very person redefining the standards of banking. And they certainly didn't know that this truth was about to be revealed right there, in the place where they believed they held all the power to judge. The position of CEO didn't make Monique Ellis forget the real reason she entered the banking industry: to bring fairness and opportunity to those left behind. In the first few months of her tenure, she continuously received summary reports from various departments: growth indicators, satisfaction ratings, employee performance. All were fine, impressive even. But Monique knew well that average numbers could hide a great deal of injustice at individual points of contact. One branch in particular, Ashford branch, the headquarters of Sterling Capital in the state where the bank was first founded, was consistently reported as exceeding expectations. The highest rate of new account openings in the system, strong profits, no serious complaints. But Monique didn't stop at summary reports. She requested access to all customer exit interviews and anonymous surveys from clients who left the bank. When the data was broken down by ethnicity and occupation, a troubling trend emerged. The attrition rate among customers of color, particularly African American and Latino clients, was 3 times higher than other groups. Most didn't state a clear reason, only vague phrases like "felt unwelcome" or "unprofessional service." Monique sighed. She knew that feeling. The feeling of being judged from the very first glance, of being asked questions others weren't, of being steered toward lower-tier services, even when your assets exceeded those of the person being invited into the VIP room simply for wearing a tailored suit. Instead of sending an audit team, instead of calling a sudden meeting, Monique chose the approach she trusted most, experiencing it herself. On a Tuesday morning, she stepped out of her downtown penthouse apartment dressed in a simple indigo hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of worn sneakers that had been carefully cleaned. Her natural curly hair was neatly tied back. No makeup. On her arm was a soft leather bag, a gift from her close assistant team when she took the CEO role. Nothing about her appearance hinted at a multi-million-dollar executive. Her luxury SUV remained in the underground garage. That day, she took a rideshare. In the back seat, she quietly reviewed the plan. No recording, no hidden camera, just a customer withdrawing money from her own account. A simple action, if treated fairly. At 9:12 a.m., Monique walked through the revolving doors of the Ashford branch. The scent of freshly mopped granite floors, the whir of the money counter behind the teller station, and the watchful glance of the receptionist all reminded her of her early days in the industry. But now, she wasn't the silent intern behind the POS terminal. She was the person in charge of the entire system, though no one there recognized her. She sat in the waiting area, pretending to check her phone while watching each transaction carefully. A middle-aged white man walked in, and before he even reached the counter, a staff member greeted him, shook his hand, and escorted him to a private office. Moments later, an Asian couple was told to take a number and wait, with no smile, no warmth. A fashionably dressed young white woman was engaged in pleasant small talk while completing her transaction. Meanwhile, a brown-skinned man in a work uniform was asked for 3 extra forms of ID and spent nearly 15 minutes on a simple transaction. Monique took a deep breath. Everything she suspected was unfolding right in front of her. She looked around. There were no media cameras. Just a 47-year-old woman sitting in a bank lobby, witnessing discrimination unfold in silence. But what she was about to do would not remain silent. Because sometimes, change doesn't begin with grand speeches or inspirational platforms. It begins with a glance, a gaze, and a simple sentence. "I'd like to withdraw money from my account." After nearly 40 minutes of waiting in silence, even though the branch was far from busy, Monique Ellis stood up and walked toward the express service counter. She had observed enough. Now it was time to step into the role. She was greeted by a young teller named Tina, blonde ponytail, her initial smile slightly forced. As soon as she saw Monique approaching, the smile vanished, replaced by a wary expression. "Hello," Tina said, her tone neither friendly nor warm. "How can I help you?" Monique offered a faint smile, her voice calm like any other customer. "I'd like to withdraw a cash amount from my account." She placed her bank card, identification, and a withdrawal slip on the counter, the amount written on it, $115,000. Tina glanced at the figure, then looked up, eyes narrowing. "That's quite a large amount," she said, her tone dropping flat. "I'll have to verify a few things." No apology, no explanation as to why. Monique nodded. "Please follow the procedure," she replied, still composed. But she knew well that the white man who had walked in 15 minutes before her had withdrawn a similar amount and no one had asked him for anything extra. Tina made an internal call, whispering something. A minute later, Mark, a senior teller, arrived and stood behind her with his arms crossed, as if to assert authority. "What's going on here?" he asked loudly, eyeing Monique like she was a problem to be dealt with. "There's no issue," Monique replied, placing her corporate card on the counter as well. "I'm conducting a legal transaction, with complete documentation." Mark picked up Monique's documents, examined them in detail, and frowned. "We'll need to review your transaction history first. There have been suspicious cases lately." He paused, emphasizing the word suspicious, as if implying something more than standard procedure. Monique understood the insinuation. The looks, the judgmental glances, the whispers behind her back, she had known them all too well from the early years of her career. But not once, not ever, had they broken her. Tina began entering data into the system. Meanwhile, another man, Richard, one of the senior staff at Ashford branch, approached and said something that made the entire space fall silent for a brief second. "Are you sure this money is yours? Lottery win, or maybe someone helping you out?" His voice was half laughing, half mocking, a remark disguised as a joke yet saturated with prejudice. Monique didn't respond. She stood straighter, her gaze growing firmer. "I would like to complete my transaction professionally. If that's not possible, I'd like to speak to someone with higher authority." At that moment, Jessica Grayson, the branch manager, appeared. She stepped out of her office with a commanding posture, but her eyes turned cold upon seeing Monique. No greeting, no introduction. Just a glance at the paperwork and a response drenched in discrimination. "This amount doesn't align with the type of account you hold. Perhaps you should try elsewhere." The entire banking hall seemed to freeze. One customer looked up from their newspaper. A young woman pulled her child a little closer. Someone whispered, "They don't know who she is." Monique still stood there, not angry, not reacting harshly. She simply said, calmly and slowly, "If the branch manager is unable to assist, I'll call someone with greater authority." Jessica laughed, half surprised, half dismissive. "Oh? You know someone at headquarters?" Monique looked her straight in the eye. I'll call Ms. Diane Porter." The atmosphere instantly shifted, because that name, Diane Porter, Chief Operating Officer for the entire national banking system, was the one person who could make the entire organization take a long, hard look at itself. And as Monique reached for her phone to make the call, everything was only just beginning. The call connected faster than anyone expected. Monique's voice remained calm, but clear and commanding. "Hello, Diane. I'm at the Ashford branch. We need to talk, immediately." On the other end of the line, Diane Porter, Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Capital, paused in surprise. The moment she heard that voice, she knew exactly what was happening. In nearly 2 decades of working with Monique Ellis, Diane had learned one thing. When Monique called directly during business hours, nothing about it was trivial. Diane shot up from her chair. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said briskly, then immediately instructed her assistant to compile every complaint report from the Ashford branch in the past 12 months. At the same time, tension in the Ashford branch lobby was reaching its peak. Branch manager Jessica Grayson stood frozen, her gaze laced with both suspicion and worry. She couldn't gauge the nature of the relationship between that customer and Diane Porter. But that tone of voice, it didn't sound like a plea. It sounded like an order. Richard, the one who had made the condescending remark, was starting to feel uneasy. He stole a glance at his longtime colleague Mark, as if seeking reassurance that everything was still under control. But Mark only crossed his arms, eyes fixed on Monique with a mix of coldness and curiosity. Tina, the young teller, still stood behind the counter in silence. She was confused. All her training had stressed the importance of treating customers fairly and with respect. But in reality, situations like this were always led by instinct, an instinct often disguised as security protocol. And now, standing before her was no longer a suspicious customer, but a woman who remained unfazed, calmly recording everything on her phone. Tina swallowed hard. She had a feeling that what was about to happen might change everything. Monique put her phone back into her purse and returned to the counter with the composure of someone used to facing adversity. "Thank you for waiting," she said quietly, then looked toward Jessica. "I believe we should proceed with the transaction until someone of higher authority arrives." Jessica, already flustered, decided to do what many in positions of power often do when feeling threatened: assert more control. "I'm afraid we cannot continue with this transaction," she declared loudly. "You are disrupting business, and if you do not leave, we will have to call security." Monique said nothing. She calmly walked to the waiting area, sat down, pulled out her phone, and resumed taking notes. No arguments, no resistance. Because she knew. In this moment, her silence weighed more than 1,000 words. Not far away, on the 20th floor of Sterling Capital's headquarters, Diane Porter entered an emergency meeting. On the screens, real-time data from the Ashford branch began to display. When filters were applied by race and gender, the numbers began to reveal the truth. The loan approval rate for white customers was 3 times higher than for customers of color. The complaint rate from African American clients about service attitude was 5 times the system-wide average. The account closure rate within 6 months for customers of color was nearly 40%. Diane clenched her fist. What Monique was facing at Ashford wasn't a one-off incident. It was the surface of a systemic fracture, a form of silent discrimination embedded in data, in glances, in every seemingly procedural statement. And if Diane was going to stand by the commitment she had made to Monique for years, that when the time came to act, they would not back down, then this, right now, was that moment. When the black car stopped in front of the Ashford branch, no one inside the bank knew that a storm was approaching. Diane Porter stepped out of the car, her hair neatly pinned up, her navy blue suit perfectly tailored as if it had been designed for this very moment. Her face couldn't hide her anger, but her eyes burned with control and resolve. Her footsteps echoed crisply on the marble tile floor, creating a sound that seemed to silence the entire bank lobby. Every employee turned to look. A few immediately recognized her, the second most powerful woman in the entire Sterling Capital system, just below the CEO. Jessica Grayson stepped forward with a forced smile. "Ms. Porter, what a surprise to see you." Diane raised her hand sharply, cutting her off. "No pleasantries, Jessica. I know exactly what's going on here." Her eyes swept across the space and stopped when she saw Monique sitting calmly in the waiting area, her phone resting in her lap. Diane walked straight toward her, her voice low but echoing with force. "I'm sorry, Monique. I should have gotten here sooner." In that moment, everyone suddenly realized Monique was no ordinary customer. Young teller Tina slowly raised her hand to her mouth. Richard dropped his pen. Mark froze. Jessica took half a step back, her face turning pale. Monique stood up, gave a gentle nod. "I knew you'd come," she replied. No anger, no gloating. Just the steady presence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why. Diane turned around, her voice now cold enough to chill the room. "I'm going to say this once. The woman you mocked, delayed, dismissed, and silently insulted is Monique Ellis, the Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Capital." The room froze. A few customers gaped. An older woman filling out a deposit slip stood still. And behind the counter, Beth, the teller who had witnessed it all, could only lower her head. "We've reviewed the surveillance footage," Diane continued, raising the tablet in her hand. "Every slur, every biased gesture, every look, every word, how you treated white clients compared to clients of color. It's all been documented, analyzed, and shared with the board of directors." Jessica stammered. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize who your own CEO was?" Diane snapped. "Or did you choose not to? 3 months ago, you sent a congratulatory email about her appointment. Or did the modest outfit and natural hair make you forget that?" Monique stepped forward. Her eyes scanned each face in the room. "I don't need you to respect me because of my title," she said. "I need you to treat every customer fairly regardless of what they wear, what they look like, or where they come from. And clearly, this branch has failed." Richard opened his mouth, but Diane turned to him. "Don't speak, Richard. We have both audio and video recordings of your comments this morning. Legal is reviewing them. I trust you know what that means." No one said a word. No one could. Monique turned to Diane. "Let me finish this," she said quietly. Diane nodded. "I've got your back." Then Monique turned to face the staff. Her voice was warm but firm. "We don't just process transactions. We process trust. And today that trust was betrayed." This was no longer just a conversation. This was the moment truth stepped forward, and it was only the beginning. Just minutes after Diane Porter's sharp declaration, the internal communications team at Sterling Capital's headquarters received an urgent directive. Retrieve all complaint reports related to the Ashford branch in the past 12 months. Open access to camera footage, demographic data, and customer feedback. On the 21st floor of headquarters, the operations room, usually busy only during quarterly reviews, had now turned into a crisis command center. Large screens simultaneously displayed surveillance videos from the Ashford branch, scenes of a white customer being warmly welcomed, contrasted with an elderly black man waiting nearly 40 minutes before being assisted. When the video showing Monique Ellis being delayed and treated disrespectfully was played, none of the senior executives could maintain a calm expression. "I can't believe this is happening at our most prominent branch," exclaimed board member Catherine Reynolds. "This isn't just about the behavior of a few individuals. It's the symptom of a systemic issue," said Jonathan Prescott, chairman of the board, his voice grave. Angela Hayes, senior director of human resources, had already begun reviewing the entire training protocol and complaint handling process. In an emergency meeting with regional directors, she declared, "We will no longer be measured solely by growth rate or profit margins. From today forward, every branch will also be evaluated based on fairness and respect in service." That very night, the first internal memo from CEO Monique Ellis was sent out. It was short, direct, and without embellishment. "Justice cannot be built on silence. What happened at Ashford is unacceptable, and it will not be repeated." Within internal chat groups, employees across branches buzzed with conversation. News of the incident at Ashford spread quickly not only within the bank's network, but also across social media after a customer recorded a short video of Diane Porter entering the branch, confronting Jessica Grayson, and announcing that Monique was the CEO. That clip, within 24 hours, had amassed over 1 million views. Beneath the video, thousands of comments poured in expressing support for Monique Ellis. Truly inspiring to see a CEO stand up for what's right. Please, put more leaders like her in the banking industry. A perfect example of how to use power at the right moment. Meanwhile, Jessica, Mark, and Richard, the 3 employees immediately suspended, became the center of a public backlash. Social media users quickly uncovered old posts showing racist viewpoints, further fueling outrage. The bank's legal team began drafting formal termination procedures and coordinating with the legal department to prepare a public response. But Monique didn't stop at punishment. She focused on something few in power dare to confront: structural reform. she convened a special task force made up of senior executives, veteran staff, minority customer representatives, and civil rights advocates. The group's name, the Equity Innovation Council. "If we don't change how we define success," Monique said in the council's first meeting, "then injustice will always exist quietly but persistently." When the meeting ended, attendees didn't just leave with a plan, they carried a promise. At the ground floor of the Ashford branch, the day ended in an unusual silence. But it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence that comes before a rising wave from within. A bank was waking up. And this time, the change wouldn't just live on paper. Less than 24 hours after the incident at the Ashford branch went viral on social media, and within the bank's internal networks, the headquarters of Sterling Capital on Magnolia Avenue had become the epicenter of media attention. Outside the large glass doors, reporters waited, while on the 20th floor, home to the executive offices, the atmosphere was tense as a drawn bowstring. Monique Ellis entered the emergency board meeting at exactly 7:00 a.m. There were no pleasantries, no political detours. She placed her phone on the table and played the security footage from the Ashford branch, the video clearly showing each moment of discrimination, from Beth avoiding eye contact with Monique to Richard whispering derogatory remarks. Jonathan Prescott, chairman of the board, exhaled slowly after watching the video. "We've been asleep at the wheel when it comes to our HR strategy," he said, his voice heavier than usual. "We talk about diversity, but we haven't monitored how it's implemented." Monique nodded. "This isn't just the fault of 3 individuals. It's a flaw in the system, a system I once believed was good enough. Until yesterday." Catherine Reynolds, a longtime board member, spoke candidly. "Monique, what do you propose?" That question opened a door. Monique reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder, placing it on the table. The cover read, "Customer Service Culture Reform Proposal, Sterling Capital, 2025. First," she said firmly, "we need to change how we measure performance. From now on, the Service Equity Index will carry equal weight to profit margins when considering bonuses and promotions. Second, I propose a $50 million investment into the Equity First program, which will include anti-bias training, a restructuring of the customer feedback system, and the creation of an Equity Oversight Council. Third, starting next month, every branch will display a dedicated hotline for customers to report discrimination, and every report will go directly to my office." A moment of silence hung over the room. Then Dennis Whitehill, Chief Financial Officer, gave a slight nod. "I support this. Better than letting us get pulled into a class action lawsuit we can't defend." Jonathan Prescott looked around the table. "Anyone object?" No one spoke. "Then let's get to work," he concluded. That afternoon, Monique held a press conference in the 3rd floor auditorium. Standing beside her were key board members, all behind her, literally and symbolically. Monique wore a deep navy suit, her hair neatly tied back, eyes steady as they met the camera. "Sterling Capital has failed to ensure that every customer is treated equitably, but we will not pass the blame. We will act." She then announced the Trust Restoration Initiative, which included a direct investment commitment into minority communities, with expansion of branches in underserved financial zones, reassessment and reappointment of all branch managers based on equity performance indicators, launch of the I Am Sterling campaign, to share real customer stories of discrimination as part of a healing and truth-telling process. In the audience, dozens of former customers who had once been denied service without clear reasons were now invited as honorary guests. Among them was Mr. Charles Dixon, a man who had been denied a loan despite a perfect file, now personally greeted and shaken hands with by the bank's CEO. When the applause broke out in the auditorium, it wasn't for a media stunt. It was because for the first time in years, people felt that a bank was truly listening. Just 3 days after the explosive press conference, Monique Ellis returned to the Ashford branch. No prior notice, no entourage. It was just her, with her natural curls neatly tied back, wearing a neutral-toned professional dress, walking through the same doors that, just days earlier, had denied her both as a person and in her position. The newly appointed front desk staff stood up immediately, face tense, but Monique simply offered a gentle smile. "I'm here to observe, not to reprimand," she said softly, her voice reassuring. Beth, the teller, who had initially served Monique with hesitation that day, was now the acting branch manager. When she saw Monique, she froze for a moment, but Monique stepped forward and extended her hand. "Congratulations, Beth. I know this isn't easy, but I believe you understand better than anyone why change is needed." Beth grasped her hand firmly, her eyes misty. I still feel guilty, Mrs. Ellis, but this time I won't look away when I see something wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, Monique made surprise visits to 11 branches across 3 states. No scheduled itineraries, no filters. She came as an ordinary customer, a small loan applicant, a savings depositor, sometimes just to exchange small bills. Her goal wasn't to catch mistakes, it was to listen. At a branch in Macon, Georgia, she met a new employee named Darnell, who had firmly stood up to a coworker who was discriminating against a Latino customer right in front of a manager. Monique quietly took note, and 1 week later, Darnell was promoted to Regional Customer Care Lead for the Southeast. At another branch, she pretended not to understand a transaction process, testing whether employees would be as patient and kind as they were with white customers. That day, a young Asian American teller explained everything to her in detail and with genuine goodwill, not realizing he was explaining company policy to the woman who wrote it. Alongside her visits, Monique also directed the launch of a series of internal workshops titled Empathy to Serve. Each workshop lasted 3 days and focused on simulated scenarios where employees played the role of customers from diverse racial, gender, and financial backgrounds. The aim wasn't theoretical training, but lived experience. "I don't want you to just learn how to avoid discrimination," Monique said during the opening session. "I want you to learn how silence can also be complicity." An internal report showed that after 1 month, customer satisfaction among minority groups at participating branches had increased by 17%. The rate of employees willing to report internal misconduct had also doubled, and it wasn't just numbers. Stories began circulating throughout the bank system. A black man who had once been denied the opportunity to open an account returned, and this time was greeted with a smile and a sincere apology. An elderly Chinese woman said it was the first time she felt respected at a teller window. In a nationwide virtual meeting, Monique appeared not as the CEO, but as a guide. She ended the meeting with a quote that would later be widely shared. "Equity doesn't begin in policy. It begins when we look at someone else and see ourselves in their circumstances, in their eyes, in their very simple need to be treated with dignity." 6 months after the incident at the Ashford branch, Sterling Capital was no longer just known for its assets or vast network. It had become a symbol of transformation from an invisible institution steeped in bias to a living, breathing organization learning how to serve with heart. At every branch, a new sign was prominently displayed behind the teller counters. "Every customer deserves respect, to be served with fairness and dignity. If your experience does not reflect this value, please call the number below." Below that line was the direct phone number to the CEO's office, Monique Ellis herself. Soon after, the statistics began to show clear results. Internal complaints dropped by 43%, and customer response times were cut in half. But what moved Monique the most didn't come from a report. It came from a handwritten note sent by mail. The letter was from an elderly woman named Geraldine Harris, 78, living in Ohio. In the letter, she recalled being denied help to open a savings account years ago because a bank employee had told her she wasn't smart enough to use the service. That year was 1984. That memory had kept her from ever stepping into a bank again. But a few weeks ago, her grandson took her back to Sterling Capital for the first time in nearly 4 decades. "This time," she wrote, "a young white girl pulled out a chair for me. She called me Mrs. Harris, carefully explained every question, every line on the computer screen. When I said I wasn't familiar with technology, she replied, 'That's all right, ma'am. I'm here to help.' And she did. Thank you for making someone like me feel worthy again." Reading the final line, Monique sat still. That letter, to her, was more valuable than any financial report, more powerful than any applause at a national banking summit. One quiet afternoon in her 20th floor office, Monique looked out over the city, glowing in the light of sunset. She remembered her late father, a postal worker who was once denied a loan simply because he didn't meet financial criteria. He never complained. He just quietly taught his daughter one thing: if you ever have power, don't use it to tear down, use it to rebuild. Now Monique understood the depth of that lesson. Life isn't always fair, but fairness is something we can build with every decision, every response, and every employee retrained to see customers not just as account numbers, but as people with stories. At Sterling Capital's year-end annual meeting, she stepped onto the stage. Before her were hundreds of employees, from frontline tellers to regional managers and senior leadership. Gone was the stiff, formal atmosphere of years past. In its place was a space of sharing, dialogue, and authenticity. "We've proven that doing the right thing doesn't weaken an organization," Monique said, her eyes shining with pride. "On the contrary, it makes us stronger because it makes us trustworthy. As the applause echoed, Monique didn't look up at the ceiling lights above the stage. She looked into the faces before her, diverse, colorful, and full of hope. Because in the end, what she wanted to leave behind wasn't just a successful bank. It was a legacy. That wherever there is disregard, seeds of respect can still be sown. That where there is bias, there is still the possibility for change. And that all it takes is one person willing to rise like Monique Ellis for any institution to be reshaped, from the inside out, with courage, intelligence, and uncompromising kindness. Monique Ellis didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't slam the table. She wasn't angry. But it was her calm, her strength, and her presence that made an entire system stop and listen. Not because of her CEO title, but because she had seen injustice with her own eyes and refused to turn away. In less than an hour, those who thought they held all the power were exposed. And she, the one who had been doubted, dismissed, reaffirmed this simple truth. Real value doesn't lie in appearances, but in how you stand up for fairness. At 47 years old, with nearly 3 decades of service, Monique doesn't just lead Sterling Capital Bank. She leads with ethics, with action, and with the unwavering belief that every customer, regardless of race or background, deserves respect. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that justice isn't some distant ideal, but a tangible choice in every transaction, every glance, then leave a comment below. I choose respect. Hit like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more real, powerful, and deeply human stories about strength, justice, and change. Because every share you make is one more step toward dismantling prejudice.